Hi guys. Today we're going to be talking about sleep disorders. So first I'm going to cover some of the biology of sleep, talk about like why we sleep, what parts of the brain help to control sleep, and what the structure of sleep looks like biologically. So in the DSM, sleep disorders are broken down into two categories. Dysomnia refers to any disorder that affects the amount or quality of sleep or the timing of sleep. And parasomnia is referred to abnormal behavior during sleep. I'm actually going to be sort of talking about treatment like within each disorder or category as we go. Okay, so there's two mechanisms in the brain and body that help to control when we sleep and when we're awake. These are known as process C for the circadian clock and process S for homeostasis. And I'm actually not sure why it's not process H. But anyway, the circadian clock is a biological mechanism that's built into every cell in the body. This is known as circadian oscillators. This is how all of our cells, independently of each other, keep track of the passage of time and know what time of day it is. All of the individual oscillators within our cells are controlled by what's known as the central circadian pacemaker, a region of the brain, a region of the hypothalamus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. The circadian clock, like we talked about in the depression lecture, is entrained to a 24-hour light and dark cycle. So our human bodies and all animals that we know of too basically keep track of the movement of the sun, and we go through repeated cycles that correspond to a 24-hour day. What the circadian clock does is it allows organisms to anticipate and respond to daily changes in their environment. The circadian clock is primarily influenced by light, so changes in the amount of light during the day and the timing of those changes can influence a lot of our biological functions, including when we talked about depression, how much energy, motivation, and sleep we need. So the circadian clock, process C, primarily works through timed and light-dependent release of sleep-inducing hormones. Primarily, the circadian clock controls the release of melatonin, which is a hormone released in the pineal gland that, when it's in our blood, makes us feel sleepy and induces transitions from arousal to sleep. Homeostasis is a separate process, but these two processes really strongly interact with each other. Homeostasis is a biological mechanism that tracks an individual organism's need for sleep and keeps track of how much sleep the organism got the last sleep period and how long it's been since that sleep period. Another word for this process of tracking is sleep pressure or sleep debt. Basically, the amount of sleep debt an organism has influences how likely it is that they will transition from a waking state to a sleep state. And that happens in concordance with the circadian clock. So sleep pressure plus circadian rhythms associated with nighttime promote the greatest amount of sleep pressure and the greatest likelihood of going to sleep. But sleep pressure in an organism is a direct function of how long the previous waking interval was. So what this does is it allows organisms' behavior to be somewhat independent of the circadian clock. Whether an organism sleeps or is awake can be influenced not just by the time of day, but by the organism's past behavior when it last slept. Okay, so you may have heard of the stages of sleep, but this graphic kind of depicts them using the type of EEG brainwave patterns that is most common in each of these different phases of alertness and arousal. Like I said, we use EEG recordings, so electrodes placed on the scalp to detect the amplitude and frequency of brain waves. Sleep stages can also sometimes be discriminated by eye movement, so REM sleep, rapid eye movement, body temperature, and respiration rate, so how fast we're breathing. But the primary way, the most precise way, is to look at brainwave patterns. So some of the different sleep disorders that we'll talk about are associated with alterations or problems with different stages of sleep. But basically, stages 1 through 3 they represent sort of increasingly deep sleep, increasingly slow, regular breathing, and as someone moves through these 3 stages of sleep, they get increasingly hard to wake up. So stage 1 is quasi-alertness. This is a stage of sleep that you're in when you're kind of dozing, like if you've ever been super tired during the day and start to nod off. This is like right when you're falling asleep. It would be very easy to wake you, like your bed partner shifting around or a noise outside could wake you up. Stage 2 is a transitional stage between stage 1 and stage 3. And as you can see, what sleep spindles are basically the early stages of delta waves, which characterize stage 3. So it's kind of a combination of these low amplitude, high frequency waves with higher amplitude sleep spindles. Stage 3 is known as slow wave sleep, so high amplitude, lower frequency. This is the type of sleep that humans find the most restorative, the most restful. And then the last stage of sleep is REM sleep. This is the stage of sleep where we're dreaming. And this is the only stage of sleep where we experience skeletal muscle ataxia, which is basically paralysis of the muscles. And this happens so that we don't enact our dreams because, well, as you can kind of see, maybe not, but the frequency of brainwaves during REM sleep is most similar to the frequency of brainwaves during an awake state. So the brain is really, really active during REM sleep, and it's adaptive for the body to be paralyzed so that all of that brain activity doesn't translate into behavior that happens outside of our conscious awareness. So in addition to having different phases of sleep, we also go through cycles of sleep during which we move in and out of the different phases. So overall, for an average person, about 25% of sleep time is spent in REM sleep. About half of our sleep time is spent in stage 2 sleep, and about 25% in stage 3 sleep. You know what? Sorry, that's actually backwards. 50% of our time is spent in stage 3 sleep. I'm going to fix those slides before I post them. The older people get, the less REM sleep they seem to need. So older adults spend much less time in REM sleep, and infants spend a lot of time in REM sleep, as much as 50%. On average, a person goes through 4 to 6 cycles per night, but of course that depends on how long they're asleep. The average length of a cycle is about an hour and a half, but early in the night cycles tend to be shorter, and later in the night cycles can be as long as 2 hours. As you can kind of see here, earlier in the sleep period, so right after you fall asleep in the first couple hours, there's more stage 3 sleep, that deep, restorative, restful sleep. And then as we move through the night and get closer to the wake period, there's longer periods of REM sleep. Okay, so way back in the beginning of this lecture, I said that the brainstem would be relevant for psychopathology. This is when it's relevant. Brainstem structures, including the pons, medulla, and reticular formation, help to regulate arousal. And during sleep, they help to regulate and suppress arousal. So they basically maintain the functions that we need to maintain to stay alive, like breathing and heart rate, while helping to suppress other kinds of arousal in the body. The brainstem is kind of the first relay for most of our sensory information, and it's the last stop in the brain before somatic information gets sent out to our motor neurons. So it kind of helps relay between the body and the brain, and it transmits the brain's orders to the body to stay in a sleep state. The hypothalamus is probably the structure that's the most important to sleep, especially, well, actually the hypothalamus is involved in both homeostatic mechanisms, so keeping track of how much sleep the organism has had, and also coordinating circadian rhythms. The suprachiasmatic nucleus is located in the hypothalamus. The pineal gland is where melatonin is produced in the brain. The production of melatonin in the pineal gland is controlled by the hypothalamus and by the suprachiasmatic nucleus. The thalamus is the sensory relay in the brain. So one thing it does is it helps to suppress incoming sensory information from reaching conscious awareness. This is why we don't feel anything. We don't experience any sensory experiences while we're asleep. It also seems to help maintain sleep, so keep an organism in the stages of sleep, and it helps to regulate movement between the stages of sleep. There's a disorder known as fatal familial insomnia, which is a prion disease where the thalamus is most affected. And this is a disease that begins with insomnia and ends with death from inability to sleep. And it's caused by damage to the thalamus and just complete dysregulation of the body's sleep cycles. So all of these parts of the brain, basically their job is regulating sleep and arousal. The hippocampus and the amygdala mostly come into play during REM sleep, although the hippocampus is involved in memory formation during non-REM sleep too. As we'll talk about in a few slides, sleep is really, really important for the formation of memories, also known as learning. The amygdala is really only activated during REM sleep when we have emotionally charged, personally relevant thoughts and experiences in our sleep. So activation during sleep of the hippocampus and the amygdala is part of the learning processes that take place during sleep, the memory consolidation processes. Okay, so a really important question about sleep is that because it's so universal, basically every organism with what we would consider a brain, which is basically just a cluster of neurons that are coordinated into synapses, every organism sleeps, but actually we still don't have the best understanding of why we really need to sleep. It's obviously very important, both because it's something that we share with every organism, and also because it's very risky, and we actually spend a lot of our time doing it, even though it doesn't on its face appear to serve any kind of like survival function. It's not helping us eat, it's not helping us reproduce. So it's so important that it like doesn't really have to serve any other survival function. It obviously has an inherent survival function of its own. All of the known processes that are kind of sleep dependent that happen during sleep have to do with the brain, the central nervous system, even though sleep does have lots of impacts on the body, which I'll get into in a few slides. But sleep seems to be really necessary for conserving and restoring the brain's energy. There's less glucose metabolism during slow wave sleep, so during stages 1 through 3. There's a lot of glucose metabolism during REM sleep, but still overall during the time that we're sleeping, our glucose consumption in the brain is lower. So this time could help to kind of allow the body to restore energy levels and preserve functioning for when we're awake. Sleep is really important for consolidating memories and learning. And what happens during sleep is the strengthening of neural synapses and relationships between different nuclei in the brain. And then lastly, during sleep, it seems like our brain goes through kind of a cleansing process where byproducts of glucose metabolism and neural signaling, which are sort of these like junky tangled proteins called amyloid and tau proteins, are cleared out of the space between our neurons, which enables our brain to function and communicate more effectively. And buildup of these proteins in the brain is implicated in neurodegenerative diseases and dementias, especially Alzheimer's, with the accumulation of amyloid proteins. So the thinking about sleep, because every function that really seems dependent on sleep and that seems to only happen during sleep happens in the brain and happens between neural synapses, the thinking is that sleep evolved as an adaptation as neural networks became more complex. So like I said, the brain is just a collection of neurons firing in patterns. And we know from in vitro neural networks, so growing like a couple hundred neurons in a petri dish, when neurons form networks, networks naturally have periods of more activity and less activity, kind of analogous to sleep. A neural network in a petri dish, sometimes it'll be really active and sometimes it'll be very dormant. Because the mammalian brain is made up of trillions of individual synapses organized into millions of networks, there probably evolved a coordinating function that allowed all of our neural networks to pause at the same time to help organize our behavior and our arousal. So that's what sleep is. It's a coordinated pause in network functioning that kind of arises as a natural byproduct of network organization in the brain. This image is a microorganism called C. elegans. It's like a, gosh, I forget the term. Well, it's a kind of organism that scientists study a lot because it's really easy to explore its brain since it only has 302 neurons. But the takeaway is that even an organism this simple with this few neurons still needs to sleep. That means that sleep is really, really evolutionarily old because humans also evolved from bacteria and well, not bacteria, but we evolved from simple organisms like this. So by looking at living simple organisms like this, we can infer that our simple organism ancestors also needed to sleep. So sleep has been a part of human biology for an evolutionarily very long time. Okay, so sleep is critical to learning. And just as like a quick refresher, learning is another word for memory consolidation. And we have 3 different categories of memory. Episodic memory is memory of what happened to us. Procedural memory is memory of how to do something, something like a motor function. And then declarative memory is memory for facts, just like objective things that we know. So we know that non-REM sleep, so stages 1 through 3, is crucial in consolidating declarative memories. And there's research that suggests that if you study for an exam and learn new things right before going to bed and then get a full night's sleep before the exam, your learning will be better. Your declarative memory for the facts that you studied will be more consolidated and easier for you to retrieve during the exam than if you studied for the same amount of time in the morning before that exam without having slept between the learning and the exam. REM sleep seems to be really critical for procedural memories and episodic memories. So these are memories that are more personally relevant, memories for things that you did with your body, like procedural memories, or memories for things that happened to you. It also seems to be involved in the consolidation of more emotionally charged declarative memories. So this would be like if you learned a fact that really like angered or upset you, or a fact that was really personally relevant to you. That type of learning and memory is consolidated during REM sleep when the amygdala is activated and when we're having these like very vivid dreams, which actually they can involve like rehearsing a new behavior or skill where all of the brain regions that would be involved in actually doing that skill are activated, yet our muscles are paralyzed. So it's like our brain is practicing how to do that skill. REM sleep is also involved in fear learning and safety learning. So when we learn a new association that's emotionally charged and relevant, when we learn that some formerly neutral stimulus in the environment is now scary, or that some formerly scary stimulus in the environment is now safe, we also have to rehearse that learning in our brain too, and that's mediated by hippocampal and amygdala activation during sleep. So this is why we think that babies and young children need so much more sleep than adults, and why older people might need a little bit less sleep than even young adults. Infants are learning a ton about their environment, so they need a lot more sleep so that they can consolidate all of that learning. Sleep is also really implicated in the functioning of our immune system. So we know that people who don't get enough sleep are more likely to become sick if they're experimentally exposed to a virus. They're more likely to catch like a cold that's going around or COVID. And that when people sleep shortly after receiving an inoculation, their immune response is better than people whose immune response is tested before they get a chance to sleep. So what's happening is that during sleep, certain pro-inflammatory changes in the body are happening. Killer T cells, which are the part of our immune system that targets external bacteria and viruses and destroys them, along with inflammatory cytokines, which are actually the mechanism that does the destroying. The T cells just tag the invader and call the cytokines in to take care of it. But basically, T cells are produced and moved to the lymph nodes where they kind of live before they're released. Inflammatory cytokines are produced, and growth hormone is released in the body. So the function of growth hormone in this case is to help repair damaged tissues. So during sleep, there are inflammatory immune processes as well as repair of injuries. Also during sleep, cortisol production, which has anti-inflammatory properties, like we talked about in the depression lecture, when someone is in a state of hypercortisolemia, it also weakens their immune system because they have less of an immune response to challenges. Cortisol production is suppressed in sleep, so that inhibitory stopper on inflammation is taken away during sleep. So this is actually why when you have like a cold or the flu, you probably feel worse at night before you go to bed and tend to feel a little bit better during the day. Because during the day, when you're alert and aroused, your body is producing cortisol, and that cortisol is helping to suppress the inflammatory response, which is how your immune system is making you better, but it's also the part of the disease process that makes you actually feel sick. This is also why stomach bug symptoms are more likely to appear in the middle of the night, like why people and little kids will wake up throwing up when they felt fine when they went to bed. So basically, in summary, sleep is necessary for immunological memory formation. So that's what T cells do. They learn what microorganisms are bad for us and recognize them the next time they're in our body. And inflammatory physical healing processes. So the production and functions of cytokines and the release of growth hormone to repair damaged tissue. All of that is happening during sleep, especially restorative stage 3 sleep. So there are tons of consequences of poor sleep, cognitive difficulties, because the original function of sleep was in the brain. A lack of sleep causes basically dysfunction of everything that the brain controls: memory, attention, alertness, problem solving, emotion regulation. It also affects our cardiopulmonary function, our heart and lungs. It impacts our metabolism, and it slightly alters the way that our metabolism burns or conserves energy. So a lack of sleep can lead to weight gain. And it also leads to mood problems. Complete lack of sleep for too long, for more than like 3 or 4 days, can lead to psychosis. There's also a relationship between poor sleep and psychopathology, both because a lack of sleep can be caused by the symptoms of something like anxiety or depression, just like overthinking things, being really anxious, being really upset or like aroused before sleep because of anxiety, or ruminating and having a lot of negative, depressing thoughts before sleep can also interfere. But also, this is kind of a vicious cycle because poor sleep can also inhibit recovery from these disorders. Recovery from anxiety, OCD, eating disorders, depression, personality disorders, substance use disorders, it all happens through learning processes. So recovery from anxiety and OCD happens through safety learning. Recovery from OCD and substance use happens through operant conditioning, where we basically change our habits and change our patterns of behavioral responses to stimuli. And then depression recovery and personality disorder recovery happens through changing automatic thought patterns. So the conditioned thought that just pops up when we see or experience certain stimuli. So all of that is a learning process. And when sleep is disrupted, that recovery process in the brain, that reparative learning, is inhibited. So that can help to maintain the symptoms of psychopathology longer. And this is just an example of that. This is just a population-based study showing the prevalence of different disorders, so substance use, mood disorders, anxiety disorders, suicide attempts, PTSD, and psychotic disorders in the general population according to how many hours of sleep they get at night. The highest prevalence of all of these disorders is in people who get less than 5 hours of sleep a night. And the lowest prevalence seems to be in people who get like 7 to 8 hours of sleep a night, which is the recommended amount of sleep for most adults. So like I said in the last slide, there's a reciprocal relationship here where psychopathology can disrupt sleep, but disrupted sleep can inhibit recovery from psychopathology. So another aspect of our sleep is actually individual differences in our circadian rhythms. So in the timing of our circadian rhythms. This is known as chronotypes. So chronotypes kind of refer to when a person is most alert and when they're most ready to sleep. And that differs for all of us. These are biologically based tendencies. So we're kind of born with the tendency to be an early bird who's most awake and alert early in the morning and ready for sleep shortly after sundown, or a night owl, someone who is not ready for sleep until well after sundown and also needs to sleep in a little bit longer in the morning. Regardless of our chronotype, our circadian rhythms are still entrained to the sun, just in different ways for different people. They're also, within an individual, there can be changes in chronotype where it's pretty normal for adolescents to have a later chronotype. So for adolescents to be night owls who like to stay up late, who feel more alert in the afternoon and evening, and who have a really hard time waking up early in the morning and don't feel alert if they wake up too early. Because of this, there's a phenomenon known as social jet lag, which is the experience of your chronotype being misaligned with the rhythms of the people around you. So someone who is a night owl in like a family of early birds, or a high school student who biologically is more likely to be a night owl yet has to wake up at like 6 to be at school by 8, experiences social jet lag, where they're not, like, they're having to do things at times when their biology makes them less good at doing those things or less ready to do those things. They have to do complex mental functions in the morning when their biology hasn't really fully woken them up yet and hasn't made them alert. In the recommended further readings and in the discussion board post, I'm gonna invite you to take a test that helps you like identify your chronotype. Okay, so some takeaways from the biology of sleep. Obviously, sleep is really critical to survival, and it's necessary for lots of processes like clearing out waste products from the brain, rebuilding and restoring energy reserves, promoting growth and healing, consolidating memories both in the central nervous system, so declarative, procedural, and episodic memories, as well as immune system memories, so immune responses to to viruses that our immune system has encountered before, which is the way that immunizations work. So because sleep is so important, it's very tightly regulated. And in this case, it's regulated by two interacting and interconnected systems: the homeostasis system, which helps to track sleep deprivation and sleep needs, and the circadian pacemaker, which helps to track the time of day and the position of the sun in the sky. So because humans are a diurnal species, all of us basically tend to be most awake and alert during daytime hours and most prepared to sleep during nighttime hours. But individuals differ in that exact timing. So how early in the morning or how close to sunup we start to experience arousal, and how close to sundown we start to experience the shift into sleep. And this influences the time that we naturally wake up and go to bed if we don't have any other social constraints on when we have to do that. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the dysomnias, and there's 4 that I'm going to focus on. But of all the dysomnias, the main symptom is known as excessive daytime sleepiness, which is basically your propensity for nodding off or falling asleep when you're supposed to be awake and alert. It's the most common, and it's also the non-specific symptom of dysomnias. It's a symptom that's shared by every dysomnia, but it has different causes depending on the dysomnia. So like I said, it refers to just a really intense feeling of the need to sleep during the day, which is known as sleep pressure, and even falling asleep unintentionally, which is known as irresistible sleep. People who have excessive daytime sleepiness might also take a lot of naps or feel like they need to take naps. It's different from fatigue. Fatigue is a feeling of being physically drained. Like fatigue is felt in your body, sleepiness is felt more in your brain. Fatigue is the feeling that you get when you've done like a really intense workout, or when you've had a really long day, or when you've had like maybe an emotionally exhausting conversation. It's a feeling of being drained and needing to rest. But unlike sleepiness, fatigue can be relieved by resting while awake, whereas sleepiness really can only be relieved by going to sleep. It's also distinguished from depression because although depression does involve both hypersomnia and fatigue, excessive daytime sleepiness it's not related to mood. So someone who has excessive daytime sleepiness is basically sleepy every day, regardless of how severe their depression symptoms happen to be that day, and regardless of basically whatever else is happening to them. The only thing excessive daytime sleepiness is really related to is the content, or the quality and amount of sleep that someone gets. So this right here is a copy of the Epworth Sleepiness Scale, which is pretty much the most commonly used clinical measure of excessive daytime sleepiness. And basically it just lists situations in which people can fall asleep involuntarily, like when you're like during class, when you're just sitting quietly and attending to something boring, when you're watching TV, when you're reading, when you're a passenger in a car. So the score on the Epworth Sleepiness Scale is basically how likely you say that you are to doze off in each of these circumstances. So if you're curious, if you think that you might be sleepier than you want to be, I would encourage you to take this test and find out. Okay, so the main diagnostic tool for dysomnias to try to understand what's the cause of someone's excessive daytime sleepiness is what's known as polysomnography, or a sleep study.
A sleep study is a diagnostic test used to identify obstructive sleep apnea or another sleep disorder. It involves spending the night at the sleep lab, which is more like a hotel room than a hospital room. Before you go to sleep, you get hooked up to a number of sensors looking at brain waves, oxygen levels, heart rate, airflow, and body movements. In the morning, you get unhooked and you get to go home. It's a good idea to have a sleep study if you have symptoms of an untreated sleep disorder. Such symptoms may include unrefreshing sleep, snoring, waking up gasping for air, somebody noticing that you're stopping breathing at night, frequent awakenings, or having to urinate frequently at night, or if you're experiencing any abnormal behaviors during sleep. If somebody's diagnosed with obstructive sleep apnea, the typical treatment is with a CPAP machine, which is a small mask that you put in your nose that's connected to a machine that blows air to the back of the throat, keeping the airway open. In some patients, an oral appliance that moves your lower jaw out forward can also be used to treat obstructive sleep apnea. Lifestyle modifications may also be helpful in some patients.
Okay, so she was talking about obstructive sleep apnea because polysomnography is like the main objective way to diagnose that disorder. But if someone comes in complaining of excessive daytime sleepiness as their main symptom, polysomnography is used to rule out obstructive sleep apnea as well as parasomnias. So what's measured during polysomnography is surface EEGs, so electrodes placed on the surface of your scalp that help to measure brain waves, so it can determine what stage of sleep you're in. And it can sort of correlate the stage of sleep that you're in with any like body movements or abnormal sleep behaviors or apneas that you're having. It detects muscle movements, including limb movement. So one cause of excessive daytime sleepiness that's not in the DSM because it's a purely physical problem and it's not related, well, it is related to the brain. It's actually kind of weird that it's not in the DSM now that I think of it, because it's a pretty common cause of excessive daytime sleepiness, but it's restless leg syndrome, where basically the muscles in your legs twitch and move around during non-REM sleep. If you're transitioning between stages of sleep, or if you're in a lighter stage of sleep especially, it can wake you up and disrupt your sleep cycles. So that can cause excessive daytime sleepiness. And that's detected by placing EMGs, so electromyography, which detects muscle movement, leads on your legs. But muscle movements are also explored in someone's chest and in their neck and throat. And this helps to detect respiratory effort, so whether someone is trying to breathe. And then lastly, during polysomnography, a person's airflow is monitored. So the amount of air that's passing through their nose plus the level of oxygenation of their blood is monitored. Oxygen saturation. Okay, so filling out the Epworth Sleepiness Scale and getting a sleep study are probably the two main things that you're going to do if you seek out treatment for a sleep problem. But these are the dysomnias that you might get diagnosed with after those evaluations. The first one is insomnia disorder. And insomnia disorder is diagnosed when someone reports subjective feelings of being dissatisfied with the quality or the quantity of the sleep that they're getting, usually accompanied by excessive daytime sleepiness, at least 3 times a week. And sleep quality and sleep quantity are defined as difficulty initiating sleep, so having a really hard time falling asleep after you go to bed, difficulty maintaining sleep, so frequently awakening during the night and having trouble going back to sleep, or early morning awakening, so waking up earlier than you intended to and not being able to go back to sleep. When these sleep problems result in daytime impairment, so excessive daytime sleepiness, anxiety and distress about sleep, or physical discomfort and fatigue, that's when insomnia disorder is diagnosed. So insomnia disorder is super common. It's one of the most common forms of psychopathology, really second only to depression and anxiety disorders as a broad category. It's very commonly comorbid with a psychological problem or a physical health problem or both. About 30 to 40% of people with psychopathology or a physical health problem meet criteria for insomnia disorder. But even in the general population with no comorbidity, insomnia is really common, happening to about 8 to 10% of people. Insomnia is more common in women. It's more common in older people. And like I said, it's more common in people with psychopathology or chronic illnesses, especially chronic pain. It's also really common in shift workers. In the recommended readings, there's an article based on an interview with like a sleep researcher that talks about why shift work is so disruptive and so bad for people's sleep and why it can cause so many different sleep problems. Okay, so the basic model of insomnia is broken down into predisposing factors, which are factors that make you more likely to develop insomnia in the context of a stressor. So you can kind of think about this as diathesis. It's the risk factors that have to be present in order for a stressor to tip you over into insomnia, but alone they don't cause insomnia. And these are things like psychopathology, so depression and anxiety, chronic pain, or just being someone who has a naturally decreased homeostatic sleep drive, someone whose brain isn't that great at keeping track of how much sleep you've gotten and how much sleep you need. So someone who doesn't experience that much sleep pressure. Predisposing factors only lead to insomnia in the presence of precipitating factors. So this is like an acute event that disrupts sleep for an extended period of time, long enough that it starts to interfere and long enough that it starts to happen like 3 times a week and cause things like excessive daytime sleepiness, fatigue, or anxiety. And these can be things like having an illness, like if you just had a really bad cold and couldn't sleep because you were coughing. It can be things like shift work, so your work schedule changing so that your sleep patterns change and that makes it hard to fall asleep. It can be a stressful life event that has you up all night worrying. It can be something like substance use that interferes with sleep or withdrawal from a substance. Alcohol withdrawal often causes sleep problems. So does withdrawal from smoking pot. So precipitating factors are the thing that tips someone over into having insomnia. They're the sort of acute cause of the insomnia, but perpetuating factors are things that keep the insomnia going even after the precipitating factors are taken care of. And potentially even after the predisposing factors are taken care of. So these are negative thoughts, unhelpful beliefs about sleep, and inappropriate behaviors that maintain difficulty with sleep even after precipitating factors are removed. So treatment for insomnia, and actually of all the disorders except for nightmare disorder that I'm going to talk about, insomnia is really the one that has a known cognitive and behavioral cause. Some of these sleep disorders have a 100% biological cause and biological treatment, but insomnia truly is a form of psychopathology. It is sometimes treated with medication, so drugs that sedate you, that just make you go to sleep, or drugs that relieve anxiety around bedtime. For some people, simple lifestyle changes like sleep hygiene can really help with insomnia and can be enough to resolve it. For people who have chronic insomnia disorder, they often need cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, which incorporates behavioral interventions, including stimulus control and consistent efforts to regulate the sleep schedule and build up sleep debt, and cognitive therapy to target negative beliefs and anxiety about sleep. So sleep hygiene, again, these are just things that really like everyone can do to make sure that their sleep is healthy and well regulated. It's important to stick to a regular sleep and wake schedule and to avoid naps so that your homeostatic mechanisms are well regulated and that you have the right amount of sleep pressure and sleep debt to help you go to sleep at night. It's important to avoid light before bed and also to get daylight exposure, sun exposure during the day. This helps to regulate your circadian rhythm, so it helps your body to produce melatonin at the right time. Bright light, especially blue light from phones and computers, can suppress melatonin production because it's the same wavelength of light that is present in early morning sunlight. Of course, it's important to avoid drinking caffeine, but also to avoid eating or not eat that much in the 2 to 3 hours before going to bed, as well as either to avoid alcohol or at least not to rely on it as a sedative, because although for many people alcohol does make them sleepy, it negatively impacts the quality of the sleep that you get. So if you pass out from drinking, even if you're out for like 9 hours, the quality of sleep is really poor. So you're going to wake up not feeling well rested. So anyone who's going through CBT for insomnia, one of the first interventions that they'll get is making sure that their sleep hygiene is on point. But because poor sleep hygiene is more like a precipitating factor, so it's something that can trigger someone into insomnia. Like if someone just like has a lot of exams and so drinks coffee all night, every night for a week, that could trigger a bout of insomnia where then even after they stop drinking the coffee and improve their sleep hygiene, insomnia could persist. So that's when you would need some of these behavioral interventions. It starts with tracking. So we typically have patients keep a sleep diary for like a week, like this one here, to identify the amount of time that they spend in bed, the amount of time they spend asleep, when they go to sleep at night, when they wake up during the night, when they wake up in the morning, and any like bedtime rituals that they engage in to try to help themselves sleep. Once we kind of know what someone's schedule is and what behaviors they're maybe engaging in that are not helpful, we implement stimulus control. And the goal of this is to change negative associations associated with sleep or with the bed, with the bedroom. People who have chronic insomnia have spent a lot of time in bed awake and feeling frustrated and anxious, or they might spend a lot of time in bed awake doing stimulating things like watching TV, reading books, doing work, or eating. In CBT for insomnia, we recommend that people revert to using their bed only for sleep and sex. This is in order to kind of break some of these associations between being in bed and being awake, being in bed and being anxious because you're working, being in bed and being alert and aroused because you're watching TV. And the goal is that you'll only have healthy, positive associations with your bed. So rest, sleep, and comfort. So stimulus control can also mean like making sure your bed is comfortable, dealing with any like drafts in your room, getting new bedding and new pillows if that's going to help. Anything to try to help break that association between being in bed and being awake. We often teach people relaxation techniques, again, to help promote a state of relaxation and a state of lower anxiety while they're in bed so that they can pair that relaxed state with being in bed. But really importantly, one of the most effective and helpful behavioral techniques in CBT for insomnia is sleep restriction. So basically, something that people with insomnia tend to do that is actually unhelpful and backfires is they'll go to bed really early and they'll try to stay in bed really late. They'll try to maximize the amount of time that they're in bed in the hopes that they'll catch up on sleep and spend that time sleeping. But what usually happens is that because they have trouble falling asleep or they have trouble maintaining sleep, they spend a really long time in bed, but not much of that time is spent sleeping. So through tracking, we try to identify the average number of hours they're sleeping a night, and then we restrict their time in bed to just that number of hours. So if a patient comes in who's sleeping for 5 hours a night, but maybe spending like 8 or 9 hours in bed with, 3 or 4 of those hours being awake, reading, watching TV, or trying to get to sleep, we start by saying, okay, you're only going to spend 5 hours in bed. Doesn't matter if you're sleeping during those 5 hours, but you're only going to go to bed at the time that you normally fall asleep at night. And you're going to get out of bed at the time that you wake up in the morning. I don't care if the time that you fall asleep is later than you want or the time that you wake up is earlier than you want. Bed is only for sleeping. So if you only can sleep 5 hours right now, you're only going to be in bed for 5 hours, plus like a little window of time to help them fall asleep. When someone is practicing sleep restriction, if they're not asleep within about 10 minutes, we instruct them to get up, get out of bed, go to another room of the house if possible, and do something else. Something that's not too like exciting or arousing and something that doesn't involve screens, ideally, until they start to feel sleepy again, and then they can go back to bed and try again. It's really important that when you're doing sleep restriction, even if you at first aren't able to be asleep for the full amount of time that you're in bed, you shouldn't stay in bed longer. You shouldn't nap. You shouldn't go to bed earlier the next day. You should really stick to that restricted sleep schedule. And then once you're able to actually spend those 5 hours in bed asleep, then we'll start adding more time. So in usually like half-hour increments until we reach 7 to 8 hours, like a healthy amount of sleep. So the overall goal is to reduce conditioned arousal at bedtime, as well as to promote relaxation and sleep pressure before someone goes to bed. But it's really important when someone has a lot of, gosh, I can never remember the other P. I'm so sorry. When someone has a lot of perpetuating factors, which we also call maintaining factors in psychopathology, and we only call them perpetuating factors in insomnia because there's 2 other Ps. But anyway, when someone has a lot of perpetuating factors, those factors are contributing to arousal at bedtime. That's like really the main perpetuating factor. And in the behavioral part of CBT for insomnia, we're using behavioral techniques to change the associations around bedtime to reduce any conditioned arousal, any arousal that is like an automatic response to that context. Okay, so the cognitive interventions really target unhelpful beliefs around sleep that also contribute to arousal before bed and because they contribute to anxiety. So people who have insomnia will often spend a lot of time, for one thing, like really trying hard to get to sleep and really focusing on the fact that like if I go to sleep now, I'll be able to sleep for 5 hours, but if I'm awake for another hour, I'll only get 4 hours of sleep. And they tend to ruminate over the consequences of that. So lying in bed at night, thinking about how crappy they're going to feel the next day, worrying that they're not going to be functioning well at work, that type of repetitive ruminative thinking about the consequences of not sleeping definitely makes it harder to sleep because it's making you anxious. People with insomnia and unhelpful beliefs around sleep will often make misattributions about the cause of insomnia, or they'll amplify the importance of insomnia. So they'll attribute it to like really serious mental health problems or physical health problems. They'll sort of think of themselves as someone who can't sleep. They'll, be up all night reading studies about fatal familial insomnia and wonder if this is the beginning of like a neurodegenerative disease process for them. Also, they'll misattribute insomnia to stable external causes, like I can't sleep because I live in a city and there's too much outside noise. I can't sleep because I get too hot at night. I can't sleep because I'm just an anxious person and that's not something that's going to change. We want them to shift to attributing their problems of sleep to arousal at bedtime. That's really the main factor that maintains or perpetuates insomnia. And that is not something that's stable. That's something that we can change by changing conditioned associations around bed, by promoting relaxation before bed through behavioral relaxation techniques, and by using cognitive strategies to reduce anxiety before bed. People with insomnia may have unrealistic expectations about sleep. So often they actually underestimate how much sleep they're really getting. They will say like, oh my God, I definitely only slept an hour last night. I was tossing and turning all night. But in reality, a lot of what they remember as tossing and turning was really being in a later stage of sleep, or they're just sort of catastrophizing and exaggerating how little sleep they get. So the sleep tracking phase of CBT for insomnia, which actually continues throughout treatment because we want to track how much sleep they're getting as we do the intervention to make sure they're getting better. sleep tracking can correct some of that misinformation and actually help people relax a little bit when they realize that they're really getting like 4 or 5 hours when they thought they were only getting 1. People with insomnia may also overestimate how much sleep they need to function. So it's ideal for people to get 7 to 8 hours of sleep, but really we can function on less than that. And although it isn't great for us in the long term, it doesn't really have any huge short-term consequences. It may make us more likely to catch a cold. It may make us feel grumpy or crappy the next day, but it's not going to kill us. It's not going to hurt us. And because it's not a permanent thing, it's not stable, we don't have to worry that much about it because it's something that we can change. And when a patient has these attributions and this anxiety in therapy, we point out, you know, what you're doing right now is ensuring that you'll get adequate sleep for the rest of your life. So it doesn't matter as much if you sleep super well tonight as it does if you learn how to reduce your bedtime arousal for the future. And then lastly, going back to some of these behavioral stimulus control techniques, people with insomnia often have misconceptions about how they should be promoting sleep. So one thing that people with insomnia will do is they'll try really, really hard to sleep. And that does not work. It creates arousal, it creates anxiety. You can't try to sleep. Sleep is just something that happens. We can't control it, really. Also, they might believe that if they just sort of compensate for their lack of sleep by resting a lot or taking naps the next day or by going to bed really, really early, they can make up for the sleep that they lost. But again, that just creates a lack of sleep pressure when they go to bed if they take naps during the day, or it creates conditioned associations between being in bed and being awake because they go to bed really early but don't go to sleep. Okay, sorry. Speaking of chronotypes, I usually record these things in the morning because I'm a morning person, but it's nighttime right now, so I had to turn on the light. Okay, so putting all the pieces together in CBT for insomnia, the main target is bedtime arousal. Whatever predisposed someone to having problems with sleep, whatever triggered the initial bout of insomnia, the thing that's maintaining it is too much arousal at bedtime, either because of bad habits and conditioned associations with the bedroom or because of negative thoughts, usually both. So bedtime arousal is attributed to perpetuating factors like continued poor sleep hygiene, but especially conditioned associations around the bedroom and the bed, and maladaptive thinking about sleep. So interventions for insomnia involve stimulus control to change those associations, sleep restriction to build up sleep pressure and make it easier to fall asleep as soon as you're in bed to help change the associations, and cognitive restructuring to change the way that people think about sleep that causes anxiety and arousal. But very importantly, you can't make yourself sleep. You can't try to sleep. And trying is something that can perpetuate insomnia. Okay, so another dysomnia that we're going to talk about is narcolepsy. Narcolepsy involves recurrent periods of what the DSM calls irrepressible need to sleep, also known as sleep attacks, which is basically sudden lapsing into sleep. People with narcolepsy also might engage in frequent napping where they have a little bit more warning that they're going to fall asleep, but they still really can't control it. They just have enough warning that they can like go lie down and call it a nap instead of a sleep attack. There are lots of purebred dogs that have genetic predispositions to narcolepsy, especially dachshunds and Rottweilers. So this dog is demonstrating a sleep attack where it's awake and alert and actually highly aroused. And then all of a sudden, bam, it's just asleep. This dog is demonstrating one of the clinical signs of narcolepsy, cataplexy, where it's awake and alert, but its muscles are paralyzed. Clinically, to diagnose narcolepsy, we have to observe one of these signs. So we have to observe cataplexy, where someone experiences these like brief losses of muscle tone and basically temporary paralysis. Or someone has to have polysomnography, a sleep study that shows short REM latency, where they basically lapse into REM sleep almost immediately on falling asleep. It's normal for someone to spend a lot more time in the first 3 stages of sleep, in the first phase of sleep, in the first cycle. But lapsing immediately into REM is really uncommon unless someone is like seriously sleep deprived. But in polysomnography, we can observe a really short latency going into REM, and that's one of the clinical signs that we use to diagnose narcolepsy. The actual cause of narcolepsy is hypocretin deficiency, and I'm going to talk about that on the next slide, I think. But it's not as often used to diagnose narcolepsy because really the only way that we can assess hypocretin deficiency is with cerebrospinal fluid. And doing a spinal tap is really invasive. And if someone has cataplexy and or short REM latency and experiences sleep attacks, then we can be pretty sure that they have narcolepsy and probably have hypocretin deficiency. So There are several known genetic mutations, like the ones in dogs, that cause narcolepsy. Also, diseases that affect the part of the brain, the part of the hypothalamus that produces hypocretin can cause narcolepsy. So a tumor in that part of your brain that destroys the hypocretin cells, or a bilateral stroke in that part of your brain. Okay, so like I said, narcolepsy is caused by deficient production and signaling of hypocretin, which is also known as orexin. This is hypocretin. It's a neurotransmitter that's produced in the hypothalamus, and its production is actually controlled by the suprachiasmatic nucleus. So signals from the suprachiasmatic nucleus signal in the part of the hypothalamus that produces hypocretin. So our hypocretin production is controlled by our biological clock. It's also controlled by our sleep debt. Hypocretin signaling in the hypothalamus, or in the hypothalamus and from the hypothalamus to the brainstem, basically results in consolidated periods of being awake. So when our brain is producing hypocretin at the normal rate, we sustain alertness. We stay awake the whole time. And when our circadian clock signals to that part of the brain to stop producing hypocretin because it's nighttime, it's time for us to start to sleep, the reduction in hypocretin signaling in our brainstem is what helps us transition into sleep. So in general, hypocretin is really important in sleep, but overall, it's important in regulating our body's homeostasis. So it's also involved in regulating homeostasis through energy balance, figuring out and tracking how much energy intake we have, and helping to balance energy expenditure. But overall, hypocretin is really important in maintaining homeostasis. It's a homeostatic mechanism, and it's, I don't want to say primary function, but probably it's like most important function for humans, one that isn't redundant with other hormones and neurotransmitters, is regulating sleep and wakefulness. So cataplexy is really interesting. Whoops, I'm going to play that after. Okay. Cataplexy, like I said, basically involves brief episodes of sudden bilateral loss of muscle tone. So this is basically paralysis, where someone is awake and alert, but they can't move. It's very sudden, but it's also very temporary. It usually only lasts at most like a minute or two. The interesting thing about cataplexy is that for people who have narcolepsy with cataplexy, it's precipitated by emotional arousal. And it's actually usually precipitated by positive emotions. That's the most common trigger for cataplexy. But it can also be caused by extreme negative emotions too, just any like intense arousal. And interestingly, intense emotions can cause muscle weakness for healthy people too. It's just that paralysis isn't associated with sudden onset of REM sleep in the way that it is in cataplexy, because healthy people have normal hypocretin signaling that keeps us awake and alert no matter what is happening in our bodies. But if you think about like a time when you were really surprised, you might have felt like your knees kind of buckle a little bit, or a time when you were really, really scared or anxious, it kind of feels like your arms are sort of heavy and numb. That is the effect of cataplexy. It's the effect of strong emotions on the action of motor neurons in your muscles. This is something that happens when we're in REM sleep. Our muscles are paralyzed during REM sleep. And during REM, during healthy REM sleep, that paralysis is happening through inhibitory signals that are being sent to our muscles. But cataplexy can also happen when there's a lack of excitatory signals going to our muscles too. Okay, so this is a first-person perspective on what it's like to live with narcolepsy and what it's like to have cataplexy.
Narcolepsy causes me to fall asleep anywhere between 40 and 50 times a day on a good day, probably more than that on a bad day. And it can be anywhere between a few seconds. If I'm sitting up, if I'm at home, then it can probably be more than that, because if I'm comfortable, if I'm sitting on a chair, if I've got something to rest my head back on, it can be anywhere between sort of, well, up to 45 minutes. And it impacts massively on my life, because it means that everything I do, I have to think about how much energy it's going to take up, how long afterwards it's going to take me to recover, and if I'm going to be safe, because it's not just the falling asleep, but cataplexy as well, which can leave me quite vulnerable in certain situations, public transport, or if I'm by myself without a friend. So it impacts on everything I do, really, because you just have to think about things that somebody who didn't have narcolepsy wouldn't have to think about before doing something simple. Even something like going swimming. I don't go swimming anymore because there's a risk that I could have cataplexy in the swimming pool and start drowning, which has happened before. So it impacts massively.
Okay. So that's why narcolepsy is impairing. It really, if you're prone to falling asleep and losing all muscle tone without any control, it really limits the things that you can do. And people with really severe narcolepsy can't drive most of the time. Okay, so some takeaways from narcolepsy. So because narcolepsy is a problem with maintaining arousal, the dominant treatment for it has been stimulant medications. People with narcolepsy are also treated with antidepressants because they seem to help prevent cataplexy. But an emerging treatment for narcolepsy that has a lot of promise, depending on the cause of the hypocretin deficiency, is hypocretin supplementation. Taking exogenous hypocretin can help replace the hypocretin that our bodies aren't producing. If the problem is with hypocretin receptors, though, and not with hypocretin production, then supplementing hypocretin doesn't help because our body's already making it, it's just not reaching its target. So, but the important thing about narcolepsy is that it has a very specific known biological cause. It's a lack of hypocretin production and signaling, causing dysregulation of the sleep and wake cycle. Hypocretin signaling in our brainstem maintains consistent arousal during our awake period. And when hypocretin is suppressed during sleep, it allows us to maintain consistent sleep as well. A lack of hypocretin, similar to the permissive hypothesis of serotonin, where steady serotonin signaling helps to regulate fluctuations in dopamine and noradrenaline signaling, steady hypocretin signaling helps to regulate fluctuations in other neurotransmitters and hormones that can cause sleep. So it can cause sleep onset, and that can cause things like cataplexy, the paralysis that should be happening during REM sleep. Okay, so 2 more dysomnias, and then we're going to talk about some parasomnias. The next one is circadian rhythm sleep disorders. This is when someone has a persistently disrupted sleep pattern caused by a misalignment between their internal circadian rhythm, their internal clock, and the sleep-wake schedule of the society around them. So what's required by their job or their social life, or even outside of those factors, if they have a nocturnal sleep-wake schedule, but they live in a big city and can't afford like blackout curtains and sound canceling machines, that would be impairing too, because it's a mismatch with the environment. The disruption that comes from having this dysregulated sleep cycle that's not entrained to your environment leads to excessive daytime sleepiness, or it can lead to problems falling asleep, or usually both. Sleep phase can be delayed, where your body starts producing melatonin really late in the day, long after the sun has gone down, and makes it harder for you to fall asleep at the time you want to. Also makes it harder for you to wake up early in the morning. Or advanced, where your body starts producing melatonin and readying you for sleep too early before the sun has gone down. Basically, these disorders are extremes of normal variations in chronotype and circadian rhythm, and there's actually really nothing inherently disordered about them. It's just that we live in a society where everyone is living by the same artificial schedule, artificial like clock. We talked about how that causes problems with seasonal depression because our daily schedule isn't responsive to diurnal patterns in the sun. But this is a case where someone's completely normal biology just doesn't really fit in with their society. And so that's really the only cause of the problem. Not that different from the paraphilias that we just talked about. Circadian rhythm sleep disorders, specifically phase delay, where you can't go to sleep until really, really late at night and you can't wake up early in the morning, is very common in adolescents. It's less common in adults. So unlike the other dysomnias, circadian rhythm sleep-wake disorders can be difficult to diagnose using polysomnography, mostly because one night of sleep isn't that informative for the sleep disorder. This is something that is like a recurrent daily pattern. Also, it's uninformative though, because many people with circadian rhythm sleep disorders can't fall asleep during the sleep study because they always happen at night. And if your sleep phase doesn't allow you to sleep at night, then you're not going to sleep during the sleep study and they're not going to really learn any meaningful information. So the way that we diagnose these disorders is through someone keeping a very detailed log of when they're asleep and when they're awake, but also through actigraphy, which is basically like a fancy Apple Watch that keeps track of how much someone is moving around. And it can also do things like keep track of body temperature and respiration rate. So it can help show when someone's inactive phase starts. This is a pretty normal sleep schedule. They become inactive between like 9 o'clock at night and maybe 10 o'clock at night. If someone has phase delay, they would start to become inactive sometime after midnight and stay inactive as late as like 12. If someone has phase advance, they would start to become inactive during this afternoon period and become active again maybe around 12 a.m. So yeah, delayed sleep phase is sleep onset after midnight, and advanced sleep phase is sleep onset in the afternoon. So the way that we treat circadian rhythm sleep disorders is actually, it's behavioral in the sense that people have to really adhere to a long-term kind of intensive intervention, but it's totally biological. So the way it works is using bright light and exogenous melatonin supplements to help realign the circadian schedule. It's done really gradually. So we basically start with where someone is at, say that they naturally start to fall asleep at 1 in the morning and naturally start to wake up at like 10 in the morning. About 2 to 3 hours before their natural sleep phase onset at 1 in the morning, they would take a really small microdose of melatonin. This is a much smaller dose than any of the dosages that are sold in pill form over the counter. I think the smallest dose is 1 milligram. Those higher doses of melatonin actually have sedating effects. But what a small dose of melatonin does is it helps to jumpstart melatonin production in the body. So rather than just sedating you with exogenous melatonin, taking this tiny amount of melatonin helps your brain to start producing its own natural melatonin. And that helps to start a pattern where your brain does that automatically without you having to take any exogenous drug. So melatonin supplementation 2 or 3 hours before the natural sleep phase starts. And then as soon as the person wakes up at their natural time, they do 1 to 2 hours of bright light therapy right when they wake up. And as we talked about with seasonal affective disorder, what bright light therapy does is it inhibits endogenous melatonin production. So we start with that and then very gradually move the melatonin supplement earlier in the evening. So if we started 2 to 3 hours before 1 o'clock is say 11 o'clock at night, we would, on the first couple days, we would have them take that dose at 10:30. We would also have them start setting an alarm. If they naturally want to wake up at 10 o'clock, we would start having them set an alarm for like 9:45, 9:30 and do their bright light therapy then. And then very slowly over a period of weeks, moving at 30-minute intervals, we would shift them so that they're taking their melatonin at 8 o'clock at night and getting in bed at 10 and setting their alarm for 8 o'clock in the morning and getting up using bright light therapy. If someone adheres to this protocol, it works amazingly well, and this can really completely reset someone's circadian rhythm. Okay, the last group of dysomnia disorders I'm going to talk about is breathing-related sleep disorders. I'm only really going to talk about obstructive sleep apnea and central sleep apnea because sleep-related hypoventilation is just kind of a garbage pail diagnosis when we can't when we can't identify a cause of hypoventilation at night. And it doesn't involve apneas, which are complete pauses in breathing. It just involves like not quite enough breathing, slow breathing or pauses in breathing. Okay, so the diagnosis of sleep apnea, whether it's obstructive or central, is made by the presence of brief pauses in breathing, so apneas, or partial obstructions of breathing, so incomplete oxygen intake, which is called hypopnea. And it's diagnosed based on the number of apneas and hypopneas that occur per hour of sleep. And this is actually kind of relevant. Let me just check. For obstructive sleep apnea, the diagnostic threshold for any kind of obstructive sleep apnea for a mild case is 15 apneas or hypopneas per hour. Per hour? Yes, per hour. Sorry, I'm looking at my DSM. So 15 times per hour over the course of their night of sleep, they stop breathing or don't breathe enough. We diagnose apneas and hypopneas using polysomnography. So this is, again, a measure of airflow. So is the air coming into their nose? Is their chest moving up and down? Are they like snoring? In their neck muscles, is there evidence of obstruction of like vibration? And are they desaturating? Is their oxygen level dropping in their blood while they're sleeping? So along with insomnia, which is really common, obstructive sleep apnea is also really common. About 1 to 2% of kids have it. As many as 12% of like young adults through middle-aged adults have it. And then more than 20% of older adults have it. It's much more common in men than in women. And it's pretty strongly related to obesity and overweight. Obstructive sleep apnea is. The what often brings people in for a sleep study is that they know that they snore really loudly, or the person they sleep with observes that they stop breathing frequently at night, or they often wake up like coughing or choking or even gasping for breath. Even if they don't have these dramatic symptoms, if someone has a lot of frequent unexplained nighttime awakenings, especially if they wake up a lot at night but don't find it that hard to go back to sleep, unlike insomnia where they would wake up a lot at night and not be able to go back to sleep, that can be a sign of obstructive sleep apnea. Although, of course, these disorders can co-occur. So someone can have a lot of nighttime awakenings because of their sleep apnea, but get really anxious and distressed about it because of their insomnia and not be able to go back to sleep. Also, even if people don't snore or noticeably stop breathing, they might wake up with a headache, they might not feel rested or like their sleep was restorative, and they often have excessive daytime sleepiness the next day because they're constantly waking up. For each of these 15 apneas or hypopneas, their level of arousal increases just to the threshold of sleep or fully above the threshold, and they basically have to wake up to start breathing again. Mild sleep apnea is 15 pauses an hour. Moderate is 15 to 30, and then severe is more than 30. So obstructive sleep apnea happens when you're asleep, your muscles relax. So the muscles in your tongue relax, and your tongue might kind of fall back in your throat enough that it constricts your airway. If you're overweight or obese, you might have a lot of like excess fat and mass around your throat, and lying on your back could cause that to press down against your airway and make it hard to breathe too. So typically in obstructive sleep apnea, someone has a lot of brief awakenings to either like roll over and change their position or just like move their tongue. In children, a more common cause of obstructive sleep apnea, or in children who aren't overweight or obese, the culprit is often that their tonsils are just too big. So this is something that kids can grow out of, but if they're sleep, because you kind of grow into your tonsils, but if their sleep apnea is really severe, they might have their tonsils removed. So this is polysomnography recording of someone having obstructive sleep apneas. And what's happening here is that you can see their nasal airflow is dropping during the apnea. And oops, this doesn't have their O2 saturation, but it would go down. So their airflow would stop or slow down, and their blood oxygen level would drop accordingly. But they're still having chest wall movement. So their chest is still going up and down. They're trying to breathe, but the air is not getting in. That's what an obstructive apnea looks like on a polysomnograph report. Central sleep apnea is a little bit different. Whereas in obstructive sleep apnea, you're breathing normally, but there's just something blocking the airflow. In central sleep apnea, your brain basically stops telling your body to breathe. This is known as a lack of ventilatory drive. And the drive to breathe, the automatic breathing reflex, happens in the medulla, which is part of the brainstem. And what happens, the way that the medulla controls our breathing, is that we have very sensitive chemoreceptor cells in that part of the body that detect the level of oxygen and the ratio of oxygen to carbon dioxide in our blood. So it can tell slight variations in blood oxygenation that happen with inhale and exhale. And our rate of breathing is maintained based on what it takes to maintain a steady ratio of oxygen to CO2. So if there's a problem with those chemoreceptor cells in your brainstem, or if there's a problem with your vasculature, so your blood is not getting properly oxygenated, or oxygenated blood isn't moving through your veins as fast as it should because you have something like heart failure, that can be a cause of central sleep apnea, where your brainstem is just not able to keep track of how much oxygen is in your blood and how much ventilatory drive you have, how much you need to breathe. Opioids also suppress breathing. So another common cause of central sleep apnea in otherwise healthy people is opioid abuse or taking opioids for pain. So the way that central sleep apnea looks different is that the airflow stops just like it does in obstructive sleep apnea, but their chest and abdominal muscles also stop moving. So they're not getting oxygen, but they're also not trying to breathe, unlike in obstructive sleep apnea, where their chest is still moving during the apnea episode. So for both obstructive and central sleep apnea, and also for hypoventilation disorders, the first line treatment is usually continuous positive airway pressure, or CPAP. This is basically just a machine that goes over a person's nose and blows air into their airway continuously at a high enough pressure that it keeps their airway open, even if their tongue starts to fall back in their mouth. This is sometimes enough for people with central sleep apnea, as long as their as long as air keeps moving through their airway, it can help their brain to continue to regulate breathing. But oftentimes they might still have apneas despite having a CPAP machine, and so they might need supplemental oxygen at night. And then, like I said, for little kids, often the treatment is removing their tonsils. Another treatment for kids with mild sleep apnea is just watching and waiting, and usually they do grow out of it as they grow into their tonsils. But if it's causing problems for them, it's really difficult to get kids to wear a CPAP. So often doctors will just skip that step and take out their tonsils. Okay. Sorry, I lied. There's one more disorder, but this is basically what's known in the DSM as a disorder of exclusion. This is excessive daytime sleepiness despite getting adequate sleep, sleeping at least 7 hours. This happens at least 3 times a week, just like insomnia, and it's accompanied by recurrent napping or dozing during the awake period, or a prolonged main sleep period, so sleeping more than 9 hours and still not feeling refreshed. It can also involve difficulty waking up after an adequate sleep period. So this is pretty rare in the general population. It's not that rare in sleep clinics. About 5 to 10% of people seeking treatment for a sleep problem get diagnosed with this. It's a diagnosis of exclusion, so it's only diagnosed after ruling out any other cause of excessive daytime sleepiness. So often people with obstructive sleep apnea will say that they get 7 or 8 hours of sleep a night, but they still feel unrested. So a polysomnograph shows that even though they think that they're asleep during that time, they're having these little mini awakenings 15 times an hour, and that's why they don't feel rested. A polysomnograph is required to rule that out in people with hypersomnia. So the main treatment for this is stimulant, either medications or just drinking a lot of coffee. We don't really have a great understanding of what causes this, and we don't have great treatments for it. Okay, so basically what all dysomnias have in common is that they tend to be characterized by excessive daytime sleepiness. That's often the complaint that brings people into the sleep clinic. Insomnia is difficulties falling asleep due to bedtime arousal, with cognitive and behavioral maintaining factors. Of all the dysomnias, this is the most like psychological, behavioral, cognitive one, and the least physical, medical one. Sleep disordered breathing is a physical condition where there's either a physical blockage of the airway or the brain stops telling the body to breathe during sleep. Narcolepsy involves sudden sleep attacks that are caused by hypocretin deficiency. Circadian rhythm sleep disorders are basically just impairment that comes from having a really extreme chronotype, where your daily rhythms are really out of sync with society's daily rhythms. And then hypersomnolence disorder, again, is when excessive daytime sleepiness can't be explained by any of these other causes. Okay, so now we're going to talk about parasomnias. These, I find them a little bit more interesting than dysomnias. Your mileage may vary, but they're broken down into REM disorders, which are parasomnias that occur during REM sleep, and non-REM disorders, which are disorders that occur during stage 1, 2, or 3 sleep. Okay, so before we talk about REM disorders, we're going to talk about sleep paralysis and sleep-related hallucinations. So we talked about this in the context of psychosis as an example of psychotic symptoms, hallucinations, that happen to like healthy, quote unquote, normal people. They're broken down into hypnagogic hallucinations and hypnopompic hallucinations. Hypnagogic hallucinations occur as someone is transitioning from awake to asleep. Hypnopompic hallucinations occur when someone is transitioning from asleep to awake. And both are characterized by very vivid, dreamlike sensory experiences that feel really real. Hypnagogic hallucinations are more common. So as many, like almost 20% of the general population has them versus 5% of people who have hallucinations as they're waking up. They are more common in people with dysomnias who have inadequate quality or quantity of sleep. And that's because they're basically, one of the main triggers for them is fatigue and having disrupted sleep for whatever reason. But they're not inherently disordered. They're normal experiences that many people will have in their lives. This is a video that sort of explains some of the biology of why they happen and also what they're like.
Have you ever played a video game for so long that when you finally put down the controller and are maybe falling asleep, you see images of the game flash before your eyes? This has happened to me a bunch of times personally. One time, I had played so much Tetris and I was writing a paper in college that I got surprised that the words on my screen weren't falling down. I was like, why are they all just staying there? I was expecting them to like start. I was very tired. These hallucinations can be other things too, like jigsaw puzzles or apple picking, and they happen in the weird limbo between wakefulness and sleep called hypnagogia. In fact, lots of strange things can happen in this state, like twitching or something called exploding head syndrome. Don't worry, no brain bits are involved in that one, but it can still get pretty trippy. Scientists don't know a ton about hypnagogia, but they are learning. They consider it to be an altered state of consciousness, not unlike an LSD trip. The hypnagogic state only lasts about 10 minutes as you transition from being awake to being asleep, although sometimes it's called the first stage of sleep. And during this period of drowsy pre-slumber, you can hallucinate. You might feel like you're falling, flying, or floating. You might hear short phrases or sounds, or see anything from amorphous shapes and colors to clear images of people. Now, this might seem like dreaming, but it's a little different. Most dreams happen during rapid eye movement, or REM sleep, where your brain is much more active than during the rest of your shut eye. And dreams are usually pretty vivid. You're part of some kind of action or story, like going to outer space in a hot air balloon to meet a clown that sounds like Sir Patrick Stewart. But hypnagogic states are more like watching snippets of films in an experimental art gallery. Salvador Dali even famously used hypnagogic imagery to inform his art, disrupting his naps to get inspiration. It's not always the case, but the imagery can come from something mundane or repetitive you were doing while you were awake, like playing Tetris. That's why this hallucination phenomenon is sometimes called the Tetris effect. Scientists don't know why these hallucinations happen because not everyone gets them, and they can be a symptom of disorders like narcolepsy, which is basically extreme sleepiness. But one idea is that some parts of your brain take longer than others to fall into sleep mode. As you're drifting off, your brain's electrical pulses or brain waves start to slow down. They shift from moderately fast alpha waves, which are typical of being relaxed but awake, to slower theta waves of early sleep, to even slower delta waves of deep sleep. But the slowing down isn't even. EEG measurements of brain waves suggest that your brain puts on the brakes faster in the front than in the back. And that means that the parts of the brain in charge of vision or balance could be active for a bit longer, which might explain why so many hypnagogic hallucinations are visual or include weird sensations like falling. And because your frontal cortex is snoozing during this in-between state, it can't help you sort out what's going on like it normally does. One of the most frightening things that can happen during this drowsy lull is hearing a loud exploding sound like a cymbal crash or gunshot. Sometimes there's also a flash of light. This is called exploding head syndrome, and while it doesn't hurt, it can be so scary that it wakes people up from their half-asleep state. It's not clear whether this is just a specific type of hypnagogic hallucination or whether it's something else. Some neuroscientists consider it a sleep disorder and speculate it might be from tiny seizures or sudden bursts of electrical activity in the brain. Fortunately, most people who have this problem aren't as bothered by it once they find out that it's not a sign of something more serious like brain cancer. Another thing that can happen during hypnagogia is the hypnic jerk or sleep start. Despite the name, it's not a hip new dance trend, it's an involuntary twitch. These jerks are basically just muscle contractions, kind of like a hiccup, and they're perfectly normal most of the time. Neuroscientists don't really know what causes them, but they could happen because of the way your body switches over to being asleep. When you're awake, you're getting lots of signals from a part of your brainstem known as the reticular activating system, but come bedtime, a cluster of cells deep in the middle of the brain starts to block these signals and bring on sleep. While this setup makes for a pretty good transition to dreamland, it's not entirely seamless, so hypnic jerks could be glitches that arise during this process. The twitches might be related to some aspect of your hypnagogic hallucinations, and they could wake you up, but most of the time, you don't notice a thing. So while this not quite awake, not quite asleep state can be pretty freaky, usually it just passes you by, which is probably good because you have to go through it every single night, and not everyone wants to be as surrealist as Dali. Thanks for watching this episode of SciShow. If you want to learn more about weird brain things, we have a whole channel called SciShow Psychology over at youtube.com/SciShow.
Okay, so that was just kind of like a brief explainer of some of the biology behind these weird sleep experiences. But let's talk about how they intersect with clinical disorders. So like this video said, hypnic and hypnopompic hallucinations are not disordered. They're normal. But recurrent sleep paralysis is a REM-related parasomnia in the DSM. So sleep paralysis is a phenomenon that occurs when someone is awakened during REM sleep. So during REM sleep, as I was talking about with narcolepsy, our brain releases neurotransmitters that inhibit activity in our muscles, basically paralyzing us. The main neurotransmitter that does this is glycine. GABA also is an inhibitory neurotransmitter in our muscles. The brain is releasing all of these hormones during not hormones, sorry, neurotransmitters during REM sleep to keep us paralyzed, to keep us from acting out our dreams. When people have a lot of stress going on in their lives, or when they are experiencing an anxiety disorder, this causes sort of chronic high arousal, and that can contribute to being more easily awakened during REM sleep. So people who are stressed out or people who are anxious are more likely to have sleep paralysis episodes. During sleep paralysis, and I probably should have said what sleep paralysis is. It's when you wake up and are conscious, but you can't move. And accompanying this, often there's a sense of difficulty breathing that many people actually experience as like something sitting on their chest. This is what's actually happening, is that although your diaphragm is breathing, your diaphragm is moving up and down, the muscles in your chest are paralyzed. So you're not consciously able to move them. And because you can't consciously breathe, it kind of feels like pressure on your chest. And it often co-occurs with hypnopompic hallucinations. So sleep paralysis itself doesn't involve hallucinations. It's like a real conscious experience of what's happening in your body, which is that your muscles are paralyzed. But because you're transitioning out of REM sleep, you might still basically have some leftover dream activity happening where your brain is producing imagery that feels really real, and you're awake enough to experience it, yet can't move, you're paralyzed. So essentially what's happening is that your conscious brain is now online, and it's like trying to figure out what's going on. It knows from the sensory inputs it's getting that you can't move. So that's really scary. And you're having these hallucinations. So like we talked about in the psychosis lecture, the brain tries to make sense of the input that it gets. And so with sleep paralysis, people will often experience it as, whoops, sorry. They'll often experience it as like an evil or demonic presence or something really
Hypnosis may be
menacing.
the key to recovering so-called memories of abductions.
Oh, sorry, some context for this video.
But
I kind of forgot what it was. But some context is that, so many people think that they were abducted by aliens, and the stories that people tell about alien abductions tend to have some similarities where they'll feel like there's a presence in the room, they'll feel pressure on their chest, they will feel like something scary is happening to them, but they can't move or fight back. And they often experience this as being abducted. So like the aliens came, they paralyzed them, they did stuff to them, they were awake for it, but they couldn't move or react. This video talks about how sleep paralysis episodes can actually explain a lot of alien abductions.
Other brain phenomena may be responsible for kickstarting the idea in abductees' minds to begin with. It's called sleep paralysis, and it's a true waking nightmare.
I was held down by these living sort of ribbons that came across me and tightened up around me and bound me down. And then, of course, the aliens filed into the room and levitated me and took me out of the room. And it was a very bizarre experience. And I thought, I'm being abducted. You know, why? Why am I being abducted? What are they doing? Turns out I was just having sleep paralysis.
When we dream, our brain switches off our ability to move so that we don't injure ourselves acting out those dreams. When we wake up, it switches us back on again. But sometimes the switch is out of sync, and we wake up paralyzed. Brian Sharpless, a clinical psychologist at Penn State, specializes in sleep paralysis research.
Sleep paralysis is the experience of either falling asleep or waking up and you find that you're paralyzed, but you have some degree of conscious awareness and your eyes are still able to move and you can look around the room. It's often a terrifying experience for people that are suffering from it, not only from the paralysis, but because of the hallucinations that often accompany it.
The hallucinations vary, but come in three general types. First, the intruder, an evil presence approaching. Second, the incubus, something pressing on your chest, choking or assaulting you. Finally, levitation, the sensation of being lifted off the bed and even transported elsewhere. Put them together, and you may have something strikingly familiar to a sleep researcher acquainted with UFO abduction stories.
I think all three categories are consistent with what people who report being abducted by aliens experience. Having a presence in the room, feeling if someone's on top of you, sexually assaulting you, or potentially levitating you.
Sleep paralysis is thought to be responsible, down through the ages, for numerous terrifying nighttime visitations.
Where one-timer place might find witches, demons, ghosts, and spirits as an explanation for sleep paralysis, it's possible that 21st century Americans might find technologically advanced aliens as an explanation.
Okay. So recurrent isolated sleep paralysis disorder occurs when someone experiences multiple episodes of isolated sleep paralysis, and that sleep paralysis causes distress. So that distress often takes the form of a person thinking that they're going crazy, or just like believing that these episodes are something real, like alien abduction or demons or something like that, and so becoming genuinely scared of the episodes themselves. That can lead to avoidance of sleep, even avoidance of like going into their bedroom because they think that there's something evil in there. A lot of anticipatory anxiety about sleep, a lot of distress after the episode, including things like embarrassment or shame, but also just like not being able to get back to sleep afterwards. Sleep paralysis itself is pretty common, not necessarily the full disorder, but the experience of sleep paralysis. About 8% of the general population will experience it at some time in their lives. About a third of college students, and also about a third of psychiatric patients, so people with psychopathology. Panic disorder is an especially common comorbidity or type of psychopathology that can increase risk for sleep paralysis. Most of the time, these episodes are experienced as something really scary. And like they said in the video, there's themes of violence, rape, and abduction, and just this kind of overwhelming sense of evil and menace. But they're actually not always scary. So I'm going to ask you guys on the discussion board if you've ever experienced some of these like interesting, weird sleep phenomena. So I can share one that happened to me when I was in college applying to grad school. So I was very stressed out. I was also a college student, so I was very sleep deprived. And I had an episode of sleep paralysis where I was in bed, I couldn't move, and I was looking at a painting that was hanging at the foot of my bed. And I had this sense that a friend of mine, like a specific person, was in my room rummaging around behind the painting. And for whatever reason, I felt like there was a safe behind the painting and he was trying to steal something from me. So because I thought I like attributed this to like a friend being in my room, I wasn't scared by it. I was just really annoyed that I thought he had woken me up. So that's the 10% of sleep paralysis episodes that aren't really scary. But the majority of them are experienced as frightening because you're paralyzed, you can't breathe normally, you might feel like you're being levitated. It's a scary experience for most people, most of the time. So some risk factors that make it more likely that you'll have these episodes: anxiety and stress, poor fragmented sleep, whether it's because of a dysomnia like insomnia or obstructive sleep apnea, because of your lifestyle, like if you're a college student who's just not getting regular sleep or who's staying up late to study or go out a lot, or if you use substances like alcohol that can disrupt your sleep and interfere with your sleep quality. Women and people of color are more likely to report episodes of sleep paralysis. And it's actually, I think, really important to know for like health literacy purposes what sleep paralysis is, because people often think that they're going crazy when this happens. And if you describe it in a certain way, it can be interpreted as psychosis, especially for people who really believe that something actually happened, who don't attribute the experience that they had to a sleep phenomenon, but who attribute it to like real aliens or real demons. Okay, so that's recurrent isolated sleep paralysis disorder. It's a disorder where REM sleep kind of bleeds over into consciousness and the paralysis associated with REM sleep remains. REM sleep behavior disorder is kind of the opposite. It's where someone experiences excessive movement, often dream enactment, caused by a loss of skeletal muscle paralysis during REM sleep. So during REM sleep, your body should be producing glycine and GABA to inhibit your muscle movements and make it impossible for you to move. If your brain's not doing that properly, you can experience REM sleep behavior disorder. This is a silent video of someone going through a REM sleep behavior episode. Oops. So one of the main forms of impairment from this disorder is injury. If you're acting out your dreams, you can injure yourself or you can injure the person who's sharing your bed. Especially because many people often report that the content of the dreams that they enact tends to be really violent. They'll have a dream that they're being attacked or that they're defending themselves and their loved ones. And so they're enacting self-defense, but because they're asleep next to their partner, what that can end up looking like is like punching their wife in the face. Some risk factors for this disorder. It's more common in men. It's more common in older people. It's more common in people specifically with narcolepsy, who basically just have like issues with regulating REM sleep in general. But it's also, when it just sort of appears for the first time in older age, it can be an early symptom of a neurodegenerative disease process. So new onset of REM behavior disorder is an early sign of Parkinson's disease or Lewy body dementia. And then in younger people where REM sleep behavior disorder is probably not a sign of a dementia or degenerative brain disease, it's often associated with substance use. Certain antidepressants can contribute to this. And people who have other non-REM parasomnias, other types of physical activity and weird behavior during sleep that's not taking place during REM, are also more likely to have behavior during REM. So this is like kind of a classic Mike Birbiglia joke story that he tells about his REM behavior disorder.
Oh, thank you guys so much. That was very unexpected. I'm very excited to be here. I love visiting Canada. I'm going to tell you a story tonight, and it's a true story, and it's crazy. It's one of those very rare moments in your life where in retrospect you're like, what the hell? And at the time you're like, I guess I'll continue living. I don't know. Like 7 years ago, I started walking in my sleep. I was living with my girlfriend at the time, and I started having a recurring dream that there was a hovering insect-like jackal in our bedroom, which I don't think there are a lot of those in Canada, but they're very common in America. And I would see this hovering jackal, and I would jump on our bed, and I would strike a karate pose. I'd never taken karate, but I had the books from Book Fair when I was a kid, and I would say, Abby, that was my girlfriend, there's a jackal in the room. And she got so used to it that she could talk me down while remaining asleep. Well, around this time, I remember thinking, well, this seems dangerous. Maybe I should see a doctor. And then I thought, maybe I'll eat dinner. And I went with dinner for years. So I didn't see a doctor, but I did buy a book. It was called The Promise of Sleep. And I learned that there are 78 known sleep disorders, things that range from sleep apnea to night terrors to narcolepsy. Narcolepsy is terrifying because there are people who fall asleep at any time for any reason. There are female narcoleptics who fall asleep the moment they reach orgasm. I was thinking you could call these women men.
That's because of positive emotion and arousal, like we learned.
And I read about this thing called REM behavior disorder, where people have a dopamine deficiency. That's a chemical that's released from your brain into your body when you fall asleep. It paralyzes your body so you don't do what's in your brain.
It's actually glycine. Sorry, it's glycine, not dopamine. I didn't realize he said that. Glycine.
Away from some kind of demon or wild animal or jackal. And people who have this in rare instances have been known to kill the person they're in bed with while remaining asleep. And I read this and I thought, maybe this is what I have. And I still didn't see a doctor. 5 years ago, I'm in Walla Walla, Washington, and I'm staying, which is a place, and I'm staying at a hotel called La Quinta Inn. Some people correct me when they say that. They go, no, it's La Quinta. I'm like, that's not fair. You can't force me to speak Spanish. I didn't press 2 or whatever. So I'm at La Quinta Inn in Washington, and I'm up late. You know, I'm on the internet, and I'm eating pizza and I'm watching the news and I fall asleep and I have a dream that there is a guided missile headed towards my motel room, and there was all these military personnel in the room with me. I jump out of bed and I say, "What's the plan?" And they say, "It's come to our attention, the missile coordinates are set specifically on you." And I say, "Well, that's very bad. I don't have a plan for that one." So I decided in my dream, and as it turns out in my life, to jump out my window so as to detonate outside the window for the sake of the platoon. There are two important details. One, I was on the second floor. Two, the window was closed. It was January, so I jumped through a window like the Hulk. You know how he just kind of jumps through windows and walls? I have a habit of preemptively shouting when something traumatic is about to happen and someone were going to come up to me and punch me in the face. I would just go, "Ah!" Thinking maybe he'd be like, "This is weird. I'm out of here. I'm not punching the shouting guy." So I jumped through a window and I screamed, "Ah!" And what was remarkable is I landed on the front lawn and I took a fall and I got up and I kept running. And I'm running and I'm slowly realizing I'm on the front lawn of La Quinta Inn in Waya Waya, Washington, in my underwear bleeding. And I'm like, "Oh no." But in that moment, I swear to God, I was relieved that I hadn't been hit by the missile. So I drove myself to the hospital. And I had to explain what happened 3 times. The receptionist, the nurse, the doctor, "I'm the Hulk, I'm the Hulk, I'm the Hulk." One of the guys was like, "No, you're Bruce Banner." I was like, "Point taken, nerd."
Okay, so I'm going to stop it there. But that's basically someone's kind of extreme experience of what happens when you enact your dreams. And again, just to like correct a few slight misstatements, which because that's a stand-up comedy routine and not a lecture, like no judgment, but REM behavior disorder is different from sleepwalking, as we'll talk about later in this lecture. And the hormone or the neurotransmitter that your brain releases to paralyze your muscles during sleep is glycine. Okay.
Jackal.
All right. So that was REM behavior disorder, where people basically enact their dreams because they're not properly paralyzed. Many of those dreams are nightmares, dreams that have really like scary, high conflict, upsetting content, especially content centered around threats to the dreamer's physical safety, their survival, or their physical integrity. So that's what a nightmare is. Nightmares themselves are really common. The number of people who say that they have had at least one nightmare in the last year is more than 80% across studies. And the average person reports having somewhere between 4 and 6 nightmares in an average year. But that's an average. There are some people who have no nightmares at all and some people who have a lot. And a good number of people have at least one nightmare a month, somewhere between 30 and 50%. Interestingly, although older like schools of psychology like psychodynamic psychotherapy, psychoanalysis. Psychodynamic psychotherapy is a modern school of psychology. But psychoanalysis involved a lot of dream interpretation and tended to really take literally the themes in dreams, like the content of dreams and the frequency of dreams. But we now know that the frequency of nightmares and the content of them isn't directly related to any psychological disorder. But the distress from nightmares, so regardless of how many nightmares you have or what they're about, how much they upset you is related to the amount of stress and negative affect that you report in your life. It's also really common to have a lot of nightmares after you go through a traumatic experience. In PTSD, the nightmares are often like about the trauma itself, but even in people who don't have PTSD, or in people who do have PTSD, many of the post-traumatic nightmares are not necessarily about what happened, but the frequency of bad dreams about a threat to safety increases. So nightmares are pretty normal. But nightmare disorder is diagnosed when someone has chronic or distressing nightmares. And again, this is a REM disorder because nightmares happen during REM sleep, like all dreams. The impairment from recurrent nightmares comes from anxiety and also from avoidance of sleep. So if your dreams are bad enough, you might be motivated to not go to sleep to avoid having them. And then the effects of disrupted sleep. People with PTSD or chronic trauma exposure are more likely to have nightmare disorder, but so are people with just any anxiety disorder, as well as people with sort of this trait that predisposes them to anxiety, where they have consistent hyperarousal. They're not great at, they over fear condition, and they're not good at safety learning. Also, nightmare disorder is more common in people who have dysomnia. So people whose sleep is interrupted, people who wake up a lot during sleep. There are severity criteria for this disorder. So mild nightmare disorder is when the nightmares happen less than once a week. And severe is when someone is having nightmares every time they sleep. There's also phases of acuity. So we would consider it acute nightmare disorder when someone has had the problem for less than a month, because that acknowledges that this disorder often does resolve on its own. But chronic nightmare disorder is diagnosed when someone has had recurrent distressing nightmares for more than 6 months. The prevalence of chronic nightmares or nightmare disorder is somewhere between 3 and 6% of adults. It's a little bit more common in children. And it's quite common in psychiatric patients and people with psychopathology. So like insomnia, nightmare disorder is one of these disorders that actually has more behavioral and psychological causes that we can intervene on with cognitive behavioral therapy, as opposed to like sleep medicine and mechanical things like CPAP. So there's a reason why we have nightmares. Like we talked about early in this lecture, dreams, REM sleep, is important for memory formation, but especially memories that are personally relevant, things that have happened to us, experiences that we have, things that we've learned to do. And especially when those experiences and memories are really emotionally relevant. So one type of memory consolidation that happens during sleep, and specifically during REM sleep, is the consolidation or extinction of fear memories. So extinction happens, it's part of habituation, it's part of the treatment, the exposure therapy for anxiety, when someone experiences repeated exposures to a conditioned stimulus for fear in the absence of the original unconditioned stimulus of threat and danger. Extinction learning is actually kind of a new kind of learning, so it exists on top of the original fear learning, the original fear association that we have. So when we see the stimulus in the future, both our original fear learning and our extinction learning are activated at the same time. And if the extinction learning is stronger than the fear learning, then we don't have a fear response. So there's sort of 3 functions of nightmares that relate to extinction learning. The first one is element activation. So our nightmares, our dreams, include imagery and content that's directly related to our fears and to conditioned fear associations that we had during the day. Dreams, healthy dreams, include element recombination, which basically is our brain giving us exposure therapy, where these scary images and contexts are presented to us in the absence of the original unconditioned stimulus. So imagery that was scary in real life is presented in our dreams in ways that are less threatening than our actual experiences. And then dreams also allow for emotional expression, where because of element recombination, we're able to experience new emotions other than fear in response to these conditioned stimuli for fear in our dreams. So what this might look like is, say you were mugged in an alley in real life. That's a traumatic experience. It took place in a dark alley, so that's the element activation part. You start dreaming about a dark alley. Initially, the conditioned association, the conditioned emotion that dream brings up, that image of a dark alley, is like anxiety, dread, physiological arousal. But then the dream incorporates element recombination, where in this fearful context, something else happens that changes the context, that makes it less scary, that takes away the unconditioned stimulus of fear. So maybe a friend appears next to you, maybe the streetlights come on, maybe like Oscar the Grouch pops out of a trash can. And then the emotional expression changes too. The anxiety decreases. We get to experience habituation and safety learning in the safety of our own dreams. That's what nightmares are for. So why do nightmares become impairing? So there's here a distinction between what's known as affect load, which is the amount of fear learning that we have to overcome, that we have to process in our dreams and nightmares. So this is like the amount of stressful or traumatic things that happen to you, how anxious you are when you're going to bed, like how much trauma you've experienced that day, how much stress. And there's also affect distress. So how upset are you by the content of your dreams? And these are things like trait level factors like anxiety, how much you tend to be upset by scary experiences, aspects of your history, like how many fearful exposures have you had in the past? How much fear learning do you have in your brain that needs to be overcome? And cognitive factors. So like what kind of attributions are you making about your dreams? How do you think about your dreams when you wake up? And what increases the prevalence, the frequency, and what affects the content of nightmares is our affect load. What affects our emotional response to our nightmares is affect distress. And we know that the frequency and content of nightmares itself is not associated to psychopathology or distress. But the way that our nightmares make us feel, the affect distress that we have, is related to psychopathology. So what's happening in nightmare disorders when nightmares become recurrent and chronic and impairing is that for some individuals, they have a tendency to make negative attributions about their nightmares, that they think that the nightmare means something bad. They think that the nightmare means that they're never going to get over this experience, that they're going to keep reliving this terrible thing that happened to them, that sleep isn't safe, that they need to do something to get rid of these dreams. That leads to negative emotions, anxiety, avoidance, going to bed with a lot of anxiety and distress, which increases your affect load and in turn makes it more likely that you'll have nightmares. So this becomes a vicious self-maintaining cycle where our initial emotional responses to nightmares actually can increase the likelihood that we'll have more nightmares. And if that emotional response isn't changed, then the anxiety that we bring with us to bed and the fear learning that we have to consolidate in our dreams will increase. So there's two treatments for nightmare disorder. Imagery rehearsal therapy actually aims to change the content of our nightmares and promote more fear extinction learning in our dreams. So the way this treatment works is you'll have a patient describe their most recurrent, most distressing nightmare in a lot of detail. And then you'll have them write a script where they go through what usually happens in their nightmare, but then they intentionally bring in some elements of some element recombination. So if they normally dream about getting jumped in a dark alley, they would write out that whole script, but then change the ending. So after they get jumped, it turns out that it's like their best friend and it's a weird surprise party. They would rehearse that script over and over in the hours before bed. They would try to read it right before going to bed, and they would actually try to influence their dreams with that script. Also, just rescripting the dream and rehearsing it while they're awake can serve some of the same functions of extinction learning that a dream would serve when they're asleep. So even if they can't actually change the content of their dream, going through that process of changing the script of their nightmares while they're awake can help too. So that element or that intervention tries to affect the nightmares themselves. So making the nightmares more effective at extinction learning and reducing the distress by reducing the intensity and distress that comes from the nightmares. What CBT does, cognitive behavioral therapy, is it aims to reduce the affect distress around nightmares by targeting negative attributions about dreams. So people with nightmare disorder might think that like it's not okay to be having these dreams. They have to do something to stop them. These dreams are the cause of their problem. If they just didn't have these dreams, they wouldn't be so anxious and upset all the time. That thought isn't very helpful because you can't really change your dreams. What you can change is how you react to them. And it's actually how you react to them that leads to psychopathology, not the dreams themselves. So if someone can change their thinking from these dreams are bad and dangerous, I have to stop them, to focusing on the importance of getting sleep and the function of dreams, even if they're upsetting, they're still serving a purpose. And regardless of what's happening in their dreams, regardless of what the content of their dreams is, REM sleep is healthy. The fact that they're dreaming is good. Sleep is safe. People often will feel like these dreams are just so real, like I have to avoid having them. It's too upsetting. So another way of reframing that could be to really focus on just the physiology of dreams. These dreams are just random brain activation. It's just my amygdala and hippocampus having like a weird party in my head. Whatever happens, I'll wake up and my dreams are not real. Okay, so that's nightmare disorder, a disorder of attributions and arousal related to the content of dreams. Now we're moving into the non-REM sleep disorders. The first one is confusional arousal disorder, which involves mental confusion on awakening that can last a really long time. So this is, you've probably experienced times when you felt really, really groggy and out of it when you woke up. This is that, but lasts a lot longer. Some people, when they have confusional arousals, might be belligerent. They might be coming out of like a dream where they're fighting and defending themselves. Or what's maybe more common is that they're really, really, really groggy and they have a lot of like sleep hangover, but they are awake. So they start going through their normal routines, but just doing it at inappropriate times or in inappropriate ways. Confusional arousals are sometimes accompanied by memory loss or by slow and slurred speech or by kind of feeling disoriented about where you are and like what time it is. This is also known as sleep drunkenness or excessive sleep inertia. It typically occurs when someone has been awakened from deep sleep. So when someone is like abruptly brought out of really deep sleep, but not during REM sleep. Some risk factors include being younger. So across the board, non-REM sleep disorders tend to happen more often in younger people, especially children. Dysomnia. So when they do happen in adults, it's often in adults who have really disrupted, fragmented sleep. People who are doing shift work where they're sort of fighting against their natural circadian rhythm and their body is telling them that they should be asleep. Or people who still have like a sedative drug in their system when they wake up. Confusional arousals are pretty common, but confusional arousal disorder is diagnosed when it happens often and it causes distress and impairment, and that's much less common. Okay, another non-REM parasomnia is night terrors. So this is what night terrors look like. Okay, so that's a night terror. It looks like he's really scared and really distressed, but he's not really responsive to the environment, and his parents are trying to comfort him, but he's not really experiencing it. And that's because he's actually asleep. So night terrors occur during non-REM sleep, usually stage 3, and they tend to happen when sleep is disrupted in some way. So in response to like a change in sleep schedule, like an illness or something that disrupts sleep. Maybe in this kid's case, falling asleep with his glasses on, who knows? But what it looks like, what it can look like, it can just look like crying and hyperventilating like this, or it can be as dramatic as someone sitting up and thrashing around. People who are having night terrors typically show a lot of signs of physiological arousal, like sweating, fast heart rate, hyperventilating. They don't last very long. They tend to last 1 to 5 minutes. And if the person is hard to wake up during this because they're in stage 3 sleep when it's difficult to wake someone, but if they're not woken up, when this episode ends, they'll just kind of go back into deep sleep. And typically when this happens to kids and they aren't woken up from it, they have no memory of it the next day. That's because they're deeply asleep and there's nothing for them to remember because they're not in REM sleep. So it might look like he's having a really scary dream or a nightmare, but if he was having a nightmare, he wouldn't be reacting to it because he'd be paralyzed. So there's no conscious experience in his brain. This is just his body kind of misfiring during sleep. This tends to happen for kids as they're, especially in their first sleep cycle, when they're first transitioning from stage 2 into stage 3 sleep. It's pretty common. So up to 20% of kids will have this experience at least once in their lives. Often, if it's like an isolated thing, it often happens when the kid is sick, like they have a fever or they're like coughing and their sleep is disrupted, or they just had a really late night the night before. Usually it's caused by some kind of disruption in their sleep when it's a one-time event. But for some kids, it's recurrent and not necessarily caused by sleep disruptions. It's very rare for night terrors to happen in adults, but when they do, they tend to be linked to stress, dysomnias, illnesses, shift work, or taking substances that affect sleep and mess with that transition from stage 2 to stage 3 sleep. Actually, in children, they don't tend to be associated with any psychopathology other than maybe a dysomnia or like a sleep disordered breathing. In adults, anxiety, trauma, mood disorders are associated with night terrors, but it's not that being anxious causes someone to have a night terror. It's an indirect causal relationship through elevated arousal during sleep and disruptions to sleep caused by anxiety. So again, even though people look really, really scared when they're having this phenomenon, they're not feeling scared when it happens. They're really not consciously feeling anything. A very closely related disorder is sleepwalking or somnambulism disorder. This is similar to night terrors. It happens in the same stage of sleep and during that same transition into deep sleep. But whereas night terrors involve really intense physiological arousal that looks like fear, sleepwalking involves complex motor behaviors that look intentional. Traditionally, it's talking in your sleep or walking in your sleep, but it can be even more complicated things like cooking a meal, eating food, shopping online, driving a car. Just like night terrors, it occurs during non-REM sleep, especially stage 3. Yeah, so sometimes behavior is more complex than walking. And again, it's very common in kids. Up to 40% of kids will sleepwalk at least once in their lives. Again, when it's a one-time thing, it's usually associated with disrupted sleep. But a small percentage of kids engage in chronic sleepwalking. Sleepwalking is actually considered a milder form of the same process pathology that causes night terrors. Sleepwalking and night terrors run in the same families, and people with night terrors tend to have more relatives who have other non-REM parasomnias compared to people with sleepwalking. So what that suggests is that there's like more genetic risk and diathesis involved in night terrors than there is in sleepwalking. It's like kind of easier to have the pathology that leads to sleepwalking. It's less pathology, less diathesis that it takes to cause sleepwalking than it takes to cause night terrors. Sleepwalking is also more common than night terrors, and not a majority, but a sizable number of people who do sleepwalk had night terrors first. So this is an adult's like first person perspective of what it's like to sleepwalk. Although again, sleepwalking is more common in kids, but it's rare that someone will sleepwalk for the first time as an adult. So most adults who sleepwalk also sleepwalked as kids.
Tyler Krause is usually awake when he goes for a walk, usually, but not always. The Saskatoon man sleepwalks or talks in his sleep up to 5 times a night. It came as quite a surprise to his girlfriend.
So the first time I stayed over with her, apparently she tells me that I woke up and said that there's someone in the window. And so of course that kind of freaked her out. And she asked me, where's the window? And I pointed to like the wall, and so I think that's when she kind of clued in, oh, okay, he's sleep talking.
His girlfriend is now his fiance. The couple decided to film some of these episodes. Sometimes he walks, sometimes he talks about extreme events like the house being on fire. Sometimes, though, it's about breakfast or lunch.
What? Okay, so you basically spend 5 minutes and you get a walk here. Is that the same time as the walk everything?
The Saskatoon couple had so much fun watching the videos, they decided to post them online. They went viral, and the money they made from licensing paid for half of Daneko's engagement ring. Krause said it's the least he can do for his future wife.
Okay, so it can be a little bit hard to tell sleepwalking and a non-REM parasomnia like enacting dreams apart. But one difference is that when people are woken up from a dream, they often remember that dream, but people usually don't remember sleepwalking episodes. Also, the content of what a little bit different than the type of dreams that people usually enact. And what he was saying in his sleep didn't really make sense. It didn't seem like it was referring to any like real conscious experience he was having. But really the best way to tell this difference is through something like polysomnography. Obviously, when someone starts enacting their dreams or gets up out of bed, the sleep study is kind of over, but you can tell what stage of sleep they were in when that behavior started. Okay, so I'm going to talk about those were all of the non-REM parasomnias, but I'm going to talk about 2 kind of broader classes of parasomnia behavior that can happen across parasomnia diagnoses. So I said that night terrors and sleepwalking are pretty uncommon in adults, but actually when adults take sedative drugs or hypnotic drugs that influence their sleep, especially ones that influence their deep sleep, their stage 3 sleep, they can actually engage in these complex sleep behaviors.
Ambien is the sleeping pill that is most commonly associated with complex sleep behaviors. You're not fully awake, but you're not fully asleep. You can still get up, but you actually don't remember it the next day because Ambien is a good amnesic. It's also the #1 sleeping pill in the blood and toxicology reports for suicides. It's probably #1 for traumatic brain injuries. Ambien is the sleeping pill that is most often used in criminal defense cases.
During his trial, Page said he didn't remember the shooting at all because he had taken at least 3 or 4 Ambien.
Ambien was the first sleeping pill in which the FDA said women should be taking half of the recommended dose, which at the time was 10 milligrams, so it was dropped to 5 milligrams. Ambien is also #1 with emergency room visits across all psychotropic drugs. Somebody gets up, especially an older adult, in the middle of the night, they fall down the steps and they injure their brain, or they could engage in some kind of odd behavior where a spouse or significant other says there's something wrong with you, and they take them to the emergency room.
Okay. So that's just a little summary of how the drug Ambien can cause non-REM parasomnia behavior. Oh, okay. So Ambien is part of a class of drugs known as the Z drugs, because the generic names of them all start with Z's. The generic name of Ambien is zolpidem. They are non-benzodiazepine hypnotic sedatives. Historically, benzodiazepines have been used to help with sleep problems like insomnia, but benzodiazepines are addictive and habit forming, and they can create dependence where you need to take higher and higher doses to get the same effect. Z drugs are an advance on that. They produce drowsiness and sleepiness without producing dependency, and they also are not as long lasting. So yeah, Ambien has a lot of benefits. It promotes deep sleep, but there's some evidence that it doesn't necessarily help with REM sleep. So people who are taking Ambien may actually be spending too much time in stage 3 sleep. So the thing with Ambien, though, is about 3% of users report engaging in complex sleep behaviors that they don't remember, similar to sleepwalking during this altered stage of consciousness between deep sleep and wakefulness. And Ambien use is one of the major causes of sleepwalking and complex sleep behaviors for adults. And as the video mentioned, part of why Ambien might cause sleepwalking is that the dosage that people take is too high. Okay. Another type, symptom that can kind of cut across non-REM and REM behavior disorder parasomnias is violent sleep behavior. So like I said, it's not a standalone behavior. It can involve dream enactment, but it can also be a product, or it can also occur because of sleep hallucinations. So that would be behavior that's happening influenced by REM sleep during REM sleep. But it can also happen as a result of confusional arousals. It can happen during sleepwalking. It can happen during night terrors. Violent sleep behavior has the same risk factors as all of these disorders. It can be made worse by dysomnia, so fragmented sleep, lack of sleep for any other reason, substance use, and stress. The point prevalence of chronic violent sleep behavior, so the number of people who say that they're currently engaging in it at least once per month, is 1 to 2%. Seemingly, in this population-based study in Europe, the most common experience associated with violent sleep behavior was dream enactment. Almost 80% of people who said that they engaged in violent sleep behavior said that they felt like they were enacting a dream. So, oops, this is just a quick video that comedically depicts several different parasomnias.
Why are you giving up?
I'm not giving up.
You are. You're giving up on our boys.
But they're 40.
I don't care how old they are, Robert. They're still our children.
Well, sometime it's got to matter how old they are. That's all we do. Oh, sweet Jesus.
Oh, they'll go back to bed. See, they're sleepwalking.
No.
See, back to bed. They'll be fine.
Just nonsense.
I'm
going to wake them up.
No, why would you do such a thing?
Well, because.
Never, ever wake up a sleepwalker.
That's it. We can't ever do anything.
No, but they could do real harm to themselves or others. Don't die. Don't.
No, but I think we should take control. It's always about
How do you propose to do that, Robert?
All right.
They might cause harm to themselves or others. Terrible things.
Oh, you got that. All right, just said I'm waking him up.
No, don't wake them up.
Oh, that's a myth.
Okay. Oops. Okay. So treating non-REM parasomnias, which can include sleepwalking, confusional arousals, and sometimes violent sleep behavior. Okay, so step one is to make sure that there's nothing else going on that's causing this. And that usually involves ruling out or treating any dysomnia that's happening. Because these behaviors, these disorders can often be caused by inadequate or fragmented sleep, and treating the cause of the inadequate sleep can sometimes take away the non-REM parasomnia. It's also really important that if someone is sleepwalking, that you do your best to make sure that the environment is safe, because you don't want them like falling down the stairs or taking the car somewhere. So if you do this yourself, it's important to kind of like hide the car keys from yourself before bed, that type of thing. That's step one. For confusional arousal, the main treatment recommendation would be to try to use a phone app alarm that tracks your sleep cycles and is designed not to go off during deep sleep or during REM sleep. This kind of alarm exists with most sleep apps, where based on your breathing rate and how much you're moving around, it determines what stage of sleep you're in, and it doesn't wake you up from deep sleep. If you're prone to confusional arousals, it also makes sense to just kind of structure your life a little bit so that you give yourself extra time to get started in the morning. There's a more specific treatment for night terrors and sleepwalking, and this treatment is often done with little kids, but it is possible for an adult to do it even if you live alone. So first of all, contrary to what Step Brothers tries to tell you, it's actually not necessarily dangerous to wake someone up from sleepwalking or to wake someone up from a night terror. But you still shouldn't do it because they're sleeping while it's happening, and you don't want to fragment their sleep even further by waking them up. So the only reason that you would need to wake someone up from sleepwalking is to make sure that they're safe. There's a lot of temptation for parents to wake their kids up from night terrors because they look so upset and distressed when they're happening, but really they're still getting deep restorative sleep. So there's no need to wake them up. It's better to just wait for it to pass. So to treat non-REM parasomnias, patients or parents keep a sleep diary that tracks when their child or when they go to bed and when the non-REM behavior occurs. They tend to occur earlier in the night during the first sleep cycle, often within 2 or 3 hours of going to bed and within like 90 minutes of falling asleep. So the trick is to wake yourself up, or for parents or your significant other, whoever you live with, to wake you up before the non-REM parasomnia behavior starts. Waking up briefly and then going back to sleep kind of resets the sleep cycle and bypasses that first sleep cycle where it's most likely that these things will happen. After a few weeks of not having any non-REM parasomnia episodes, you can kind of phase out waking up at night. And if the episodes start to come back, just go back to waking up at night. If you live alone, you could potentially still do this by setting this kind of alarm that tracks your sleep cycles to wake you up around the time that you usually have sleepwalking or night terror episodes. Okay, so some takeaways from non-REM parasomnias. All three, so confusional arousals, sleepwalking, and night terrors, are pretty common in children, and they become less common with age. And basically what this is just that like sleep is a pretty complicated behavior, and little kids' brains are still kind of figuring things out. They still have a lot more redundant synapses than an adult brain does. There's a lot of like pruning and consolidation that happens with maturation. So having these weird brain hiccups during sleep is pretty normal for kids. They do become less common after age 35. And usually when an older person is having these sleep disorder behaviors, there is some kind of underlying cause, whether it's psychopathology or a physical problem with sleep. Or in the case of REM-related parasomnias, it could be a physical brain disorder in the case of REM behavior disorder. Night terrors are most common in toddlers, whereas sleepwalking is most common in slightly older kids. I just said that in adults, they tend to co-occur with psychopathology, including dysomnias, but in kids, they're often pretty benign. In adults, treating the comorbidity is likely to improve the non-REM parasomnia. The biggest risk factor for both kids and adults for having non-REM parasomnias is having a family history, especially sleepwalking and sleep talking is linked to a predisposition to deep sleep. So that could be kind of the mechanism that runs in families that predisposes kids to having these behavior problems. Another risk factor for adults especially is dysomnia or chronic lack of sleep caused by work or lifestyle. For kids, when they have an isolated non-REM sleep incident, it's often caused by disrupted sleep because of like an illness or a schedule change. In adults, substance use like Z drugs or other substances can cause these sleep episodes. And then many people who have them in adulthood have comorbid anxiety or mood disorders, or they're just under a lot of stress. But non-REM parasomnia behaviors themselves aren't inherently pathological or problematic, even though they seem really dramatic and they can seem scary. Just like hypnagogic and hypnopompic hallucinations and sleep paralysis aren't signs of psychosis, and nightmares aren't a sign that you're about to have some kind of mental breakdown. All of these are very normal sleep phenomena. All right, so there is your further reading and extra credit. Sorry, I'm trying to stop sharing. Okay, see you guys in class.